there are like several different reasons why I felt like putting this in a book. As you know, I've talked a little bit about like there are some journeys that come to mind around how frequently my default to problem solving really is built on like what I call an equity mindset. Mm-hmm. Like I am almost always looking for fixes that can be measured, fixes that reduce harm, fixes that improve people's lives. I think we largely call that social impact now, but there was a time where there wasn't even a term for that. And I think we can even critique a little bit as to whether the umbrella of social impact is focused on those disparity reductions. But I was always very intimately connected to certain theories that were about human beings not having certain things. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is one that I raise frequently because I really don't know if as society we've really prioritized like, wait, what does it mean when community members, for those that don't know the theory, Maslow's theory, it's not a strict theory, but it does really talk about the conditions that are needed for people to survive. Yeah. And what is important about that is his theory is that all of the parts of that pyramid, often segmented in colors, that all of them are important for us to survive. The top being self-determination. Yes. But the bottom layer, which is like physiological needs, and to an extent even psychological needs, I find that when I look through that list, housing, rest, food, healthy sexual relationships, intimacy, what have you, all of those have really stark, statistics as it relates to us as a people. And that then makes me wonder, like, well, then how are people are existing, but are they actually living, right? And so a lot of my work, whether it was working on the Hill, whether it was Innocence Project, whether it was being on the ground in Haiti, being on the ground in Ferguson, whether it's designing strategies with Black Innovation Alliance, all of them come from this space of how can we actually get the basic foundation so that we can begin to experience humanity in ways that other communities, and unfortunately often that baseline is whiteness, but in the ways that whiteness gets to experience it. And I just find that to be the urgent human rights mission, that regardless of what industry you're in with my consultancy, it's like, how do I get more people to adopt an equity mindset as a problem solving tool? So for a while I'd been, especially it picked up during COVID, I was teaching a curriculum, or a lot of what my team was being brought in to help companies with was to like, what is this equity mindset thing? And we would just kind of like talk through it. And a lot of it was just like conversations. So fast forward, our team is Pink Cornrows, like there are a lot of other facets that we're trying to go into. And so for me, it's like, how can I free up my time a little bit so that we can get a little bit deeper into how do we create more rest for working class women? How do we create more nuance in the conversations around innovations ignored by Black and brown people? How do we create more visibility for disability spaces for those that have intersectional lives and lives that are often ignored? And I was like, well, what can I do to start the conversation in spaces that I'm not physically able to be in? So the book is really an attempt to get people to fracture a little bit their understanding around equity. It's not a diss towards D&I, I think, but I do think when people hear equity, they automatically think D&I. And I think for me, it's like equity is the larger umbrella, which D&I fits under, right? We should use whatever tools we need to use to achieve equity, but equity is the goal. So yeah.
Now, I find that there's a lot of confusion with even the concept of equity and what it means. A
Right.
lot of people use equity and equality interchangeably.
Right.
So how do you define equity in the book?
Very simply, I would say that you can't achieve equality until you achieve equity. It's just equity is like the stop before equality. And in some ways, and in a lot of ways, people say equality to avoid talking about equity, right? There's this sameness thing that happens when we talk about women's rights. And I'm always like, well, then which women, right? That is an equity question. When we talk about disabilities, are we talking about visible or hidden disabilities? Like which disability? That's an equity question. So it's not that equality is not a righteous goal, but it does mean that equity then is part of the strategy to get there. So in the book, and then separately, equity has also been used quite a lot in the concept of like fairness. Like how do we ensure that people are experiencing fair lives? How do we ensure some of that are a little bit more amplified? Talk about fairness and justice. What I feel like is missing, and I actually. Sometimes the introduction is the part that people skip over. Please don't skip over this introduction. First of all, it explains the quirkiness of who I am, the foolishness of who I am, the brilliance that is in there. It gives a sense as to like the tone of who I am and what I'm trying to bring into this space. But the part around equity that is so frustrating to me that doesn't get emphasized on is that equity by definition only exists because of inequity.
Yes.
We would not talk about equity if we didn't have problems, right? So equity inherently spotlights the problem and asks the questions of how do we then get to a place of equity and how do we use equity? So equity is both an outcome and a process. So how do we actively, how do we use it as our technology to get to this outcome that we all deserve? So equity for me is not just about the forward-looking impact we want to have. It needs there to be like this wider accordion of like, but how did we get here? What was the starting point? And so that to me is kind of the broad definition. The first chapter though is 40 Thoughts on Equity really focuses on like, but there are characteristics of equity too, right? Like there's a being, there's a flow, and it deserves to continue to be expounded on, because for me to know what equity means, like for Kelly, means that you would have to sit and listen to Kelly's journey. You would have to really understand like what is it that Kelly has been missing, and then you'd almost have to, recognizing the intersections that are obvious to me as a Black woman in America, you also then have to think about the fact that there isn't just one Kelly. So equity as a movement then is really about how do I imagine that Kelly is not the only one experiencing these inequities, and then what do we need to design for more people that are in that space to experience more wholeness, right? And so that mindset is not about sitting here and needing to read every article, sitting here and needing to listen to everybody's lived experiences. It's sitting and recognizing I've heard enough from enough of the same type of people that are experiencing harm, that are experiencing lack of safety, that are experiencing, underemployment, that I have enough to figure out how to address that in whatever way that I can.